The wind howls, the steel groans, and the darkness whispers my name. This isn't a ghost story I heard. It's my everyday life. Join me as I take you deep inside a haunted Great Lakes freighter, revealing the bizarre occurrences and unsettling atmosphere that define my night shift. You'll feel the chill, hear the unexplained sounds, and wonder if you could ever survive a night alone on this vessel. My name is David Kellerman, and for the past 3 years, I've worked the graveyard shift aboard the Northern Sentinel, a 1,013 football carrier that hauls iron ore across the Great Lakes. Most people think of the Great Lakes as peaceful, scenic waterways dotted with lighthouses and sailboats. They're wrong. When darkness falls over these inland seas, something ancient and malevolent stirs beneath the surface. The Northern Sentinel has been cutting through these waters since 1967. She's seen storms that would terrify seasoned sailors, navigated through ice fields thick enough to crush a man's soul, and witnessed more than her share of tragedy. The official records show 3 fatal accidents over her 5-decade career, but the unofficial stories whispered in the crew quarters suggest the number is much higher. I should have known something was wrong during my first interview. Captain Morrison, a weathered man whose eyes held secrets deeper than Superior's trenches, leaned back in his chair and studied me with uncomfortable intensity. The ship's office creaked around us, metal groaning against metal in a rhythm that seemed almost alive. "You ever worked nights before, son?" he asked, his voice gravelly from decades of shouting over engine noise and howling winds. "Yes, sir. Plenty of night shifts at the steel mill back in Cleveland." He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "This ain't the steel mill. Out here, the darkness has teeth. You'll understand soon enough." At the time, I thought he was just trying to intimidate the new guy. Now I know better. The darkness aboard the Northern Sentinel doesn't just fall. It descends like a living thing, wrapping itself around the ship's hull and seeping into every corner, every shadow, every reflection. My shift runs from midnight to 8 a.m., and I work alone, completely alone. The day crew finishes their duties and retreats to their quarters, leaving me as the sole guardian of 78,000 tons of steel and cargo. The ship's automated systems handle most of the navigation, but someone needs to monitor the equipment, perform hourly safety checks, and respond to any emergencies that might arise during the long, dark hours over the lakes. The first thing you notice isn't the cold, though Lake Superior can drop the ambient temperature 40 degrees in minutes. It isn't the constant vibration of the massive engines that seems to pulse through your bones. It's the silence between the mechanical sounds, spaces where something else should exist but doesn't, like missing notes in a familiar song. The Northern Sentinel stretches longer than 3 football fields. Her cargo holds capable of swallowing entire buildings. During the day, she feels industrial, purposeful. At night, she transforms into something else entirely. The familiar becomes foreign. Corridors that seemed straight during daylight now appear to bend at impossible angles. Rooms you've visited hundreds of times suddenly feel too large or too small, their proportions shifting in ways that make your inner ear scream warnings. But it's the sounds that really get to you. Every ship has her voice, the particular combination of engine rhythm, hull flexion, and mechanical hums that becomes as familiar as your own heartbeat. The Northern Sentinel's daytime voice is steady, reassuring, the sound of industry and purpose. Her nighttime voice is different. Underneath the familiar mechanical symphony lurks something else. Whispers in a ventilation system, footsteps on empty decks, and doors closing in sections where no one should be walking. During my first week, I try to rationalize everything. Ships are complex machines with thousands of moving parts. Strange noises are inevitable. The isolation was playing tricks on my mind. I was adjusting to a new environment. But rationalization only works so long before reality forces you to confront the truth. Some things can't be explained by maintenance manuals or mechanical engineering. The control room becomes your world during the night shift. It's located amidships, surrounded by banks of monitors displaying everything from engine temperature to weather radar. The windows provide a panoramic view of the cargo deck, but after midnight, you learn not to look out them too often. Sometimes you see things that shouldn't be there. Figures moving between the cargo hatches, lights where no lights exist, shadows that move independently of their sources. I remember my 5th night aboard the Northern Sentinel with crystal clarity, because that's when I first understood that Captain Morrison hadn't been trying to intimidate me. He'd been trying to prepare me. We were hauling taconite pellets from Duluth to Cleveland, cutting through Lake Superior during a late October storm. The waves weren't particularly large by Great Lakes standards, maybe 8 to 10 feet, but they hit the ship with a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, as if something beneath the surface was testing our hull strength. Around 2:30 a.m., I was reviewing the hourly equipment logs when the ship's communication system crackled to life. The radio should have been silent at that hour. We were too far for shore for normal chatter, and the other ships in the area had gone quiet hours earlier. But through the static came a voice, faint, distorted, speaking words I couldn't quite understand. I adjusted the frequency, thinking I was picking up interference from a distant station. The voice became clearer, and my blood turned to ice water. It was speaking names, the names of crew members who had died aboard Great Lakes freighters over the past century. Names I recognized from maritime disaster reports I'd read during my training. Names that should have been forgotten by everyone except historians and grieving families. The voice continued for exactly 3 minutes and 17 seconds. I timed it, then faded back into static. I sat in the control room, surrounded by the steady glow of instrument panels, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. But the ship's communication log showed the transmission. Timestamp: 2 hours, 31 minutes, and 47 seconds. Duration: 3:17. Source: unknown. That was the night I realized the Northern Sentinel wasn't just a ship. She was a repository for something much older and more terrible than corporate maritime records suggested. And I was about to learn that surviving the night shift required following rules that weren't printed in any employee handbook. Rules that had been passed down through generations of sailors who understood that some waters hold more than just fish and shipping lanes. The worst part isn't the supernatural encounters or the unexplained phenomena. It's the gradual realization that you're not just working on a haunted ship. You're becoming part of its story. Every night you spend aboard the Northern Sentinel, every hour you monitor her instruments and walk her corridors, you're adding your own thread to a tapestry of terror that stretches back decades. And once you're part of that story, there's no going back to shore leave and pretending the darkness doesn't exist. Because now it knows your name, your scent, your fears. It's waiting for you in every shadow, listening from every ventilation grate, watching from every darkened porthole. Tomorrow night, I'll climb back aboard the Northern Sentinel for another 8-hour shift. I'll check the instruments, monitor the radar, and try to ignore the whispers in the walls. Because that's what the job requires, and the pay is too good to walk away from. But more than that, I'll return because something aboard this ship needs me to be here. Something that's been waiting in the darkness between the mechanical sounds. Patient, as only the dead can be patient. Ready to show me secrets that living men were never meant to learn. The question isn't whether I'll survive another night. The question is whether I'll still be entirely human when the sun rises over the eastern shore. 3 months into my employment aboard the Northern Sentinel, I learned that survival required more than just monitoring gauges and checking equipment. It required following a set of unwritten rules that weren't mentioned in the company handbook or discussed during safety meetings. These rules have been passed down through generations of night shift workers, each one learned through experiences that left permanent marks on the men who lived to share them. The rules weren't posted anywhere. They lived in whispered conversations during shift changes, in meaningful glances exchanged between experienced crew members, and in the haunted expressions of men who'd worked these waters too long. I learned them one by one, usually after nearly violating them myself. Rule number 1 came from Tommy Kowalski, a 50-year-old engineer who'd been working Great Lakes freighters since he was 18. He cornered me during my second week, just before I headed up to begin another midnight shift. "Listen, kid," he said, gripping my arm with calloused fingers that felt like steel cables. "Whatever you do, don't look in any mirrors after midnight. Not the bathroom mirrors, not the reflection in the control room windows, nothing that shows you your own face in the dark." I laughed, thinking he was pulling the new guy's leg. "Come on, Tommy. That's just superstition." His expression didn't change. You think that if it helps you sleep during the day. But when you're alone up there at 3 a.m. and you catch a glimpse of something standing behind you in the engine room mirror, don't say I didn't warn you. I stopped laughing. Tommy was right, of course. I discovered this during my 4th week aboard the ship. We were hauling limestone from Alpena to Gary, riding through a November gale that had most of the fleet running for shelter. The waves were hitting us broadside, and I was making my hourly rounds to ensure the cargo hadn't shifted. The engine room mirror, installed for safety reasons so engineers could monitor equipment behind them, caught my attention as I passed. For just a moment, maybe half a second, I saw 2 faces in that mirror. Mine, pale and tired from weeks of broken sleep cycles. And behind me, the face of someone else. Someone whose eyes held the kind of emptiness you only see in the recently drowned. I spun around. The engine room stretched empty behind me, filled with nothing but the steady throb of machinery and the distant sound of waves pounding the hull. But when I looked back at the mirror, condensation had formed across its surface in the shape of a handprint. A handprint too large to be mine. Rule number 2 came from Janet Morrison, Captain Morrison's daughter, who worked day shifts in the galley. She was waiting for me one morning when I finished my shift, holding a cup of coffee that steamed in the cold dawn air. "My father says you're adapting well to the night work," she said, though her tone suggested she thought adaptation might not be a good thing. "But there's something you need to know about the knocking." "What knocking?" "You'll hear it soon enough. 3 knocks. Always 3, coming from inside the cargo holds, or from sections of the ship where no one should be. When you hear those knocks, you acknowledge them. Say, 'I hear you' out loud, but you never, ever investigate. You note the time in the log and continue with your duties. What happens if I don't acknowledge them?" Janet's knuckles went wide around her coffee cup. The knocking gets louder and closer, and it doesn't stop until dawn. I experienced this firsthand 2 weeks later during a run from Thunder Bay to Detroit. We were carrying iron or pellets. The cargo holds filled to capacity with 68,000 tons of raw material. Around 1:15 a.m., I heard it. 3 deliberate knocks coming from deep within the forward cargo hold. Not the random banging of loose cargo or settling metal, but deliberate, measured knocks with exactly 2 seconds between each one. I stood in the control room, surrounded by instrument panels and radar screens, listening to sounds that shouldn't exist. The knocks came again, 3 more times, echoing through the ship's steel bones. My rational mind insisted this was just thermal expansion or cargo settling, but my instinct screamed otherwise. Following Janet's advice, I spoke into the empty air. "I hear you." The knocking stopped immediately. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sounds that had preceded it, pregnant with acknowledgement and something that might have been satisfaction. I made a note in the duty log. 117, unusual sounds in forward cargo hold. Investigated. No issues found. It was a lie, but the truth wouldn't fit in the narrow columns of the official record. Rule number 3 emerged through personal experience rather than instruction. During my 6th week aboard the Northern Sentinel, I discovered that certain sections of the ship should be avoided during specific hours. The crew quarters between frames 85 and 92, empty during night shifts, became something else after 2 a.m. The temperature in that corridor dropped 15 degrees below the rest of the ship, and the air took on a quality that made breathing difficult. Not because of oxygen deprivation, but because something else was using the space. I learned this while responding to a pressure alarm that turned out to be a false reading. As I walked through the corridor, my flashlight beam seemed to weaken, absorbed by darkness that felt solid rather than merely absent. The walls themselves seemed to press inward, and I could hear something that sounded like sobbing coming from Cabin 89. According to ship records, Cabin 89 had been unoccupied for 3 years. According to maritime incident reports I later researched, a crew member named Robert Shun had died in that cabin during a 1987 storm, found the next morning with his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the unofficial story suggested something had frightened him to death. Standing in that corridor, feeling the walls press against my sanity, I understood that Shin's terror had never left. It had soaked into the steel itself, becoming part of the ship's permanent structure. I completed my inspection as quickly as possible and added a note to my personal rules. Avoid crew quarters after 2 a.m. unless absolutely necessary. The rules multiplied as my experience grew. Don't follow sounds that seem to be leading you somewhere. Don't trust equipment readings between 3 and 4 a.m. without double-checking manually. Don't go below deck alone during electrical storms. Don't listen to the voices that sometimes come through the ventilation system. Don't assume you're alone just because you can't see anyone else. But the most important rule, the one that governs all others, wasn't taught to me by any crew member. I learned it through months of observation and experience. The Northern Sentinel isn't just haunted by individual spirits or isolated incidents. She's haunted by the cumulative weight of every tragedy, every death, every moment of terror that's occurred aboard Great Lakes freighters over the past century. The ship serves as a conductor for something larger than individual ghosts. She's a focal point for the collective memory of maritime disasters, a steel and iron monument to everyone who's ever died in these waters. The spirits don't just inhabit her. They're drawn to her, pulled by the same magnetic forces that guide navigation compasses toward true north. This understanding came to me during a particularly brutal December crossing. We were fighting through a storm system that had been building for 3 days, waves cresting at 25 feet and winds gusting over 60 knots. The Northern Sentinel was built to handle such conditions, but even she struggled against the fury of Lake Superior in winter. Around 4 a.m., at the peak of the storm, something extraordinary happened. The ship's communication system began receiving transmissions from every major maritime disaster in Great Lakes history. Voices from Edmund Fitzgerald, calling for help that never came. Final messages from the Carl D. Bradley, her hull breaking apart in mountainous seas. Distress signals from ships that had vanished without a trace, their crews becoming part of the lake's dark mythology. The transmissions lasted for nearly an hour, overlapping and intertwining until they became a chorus of the lost. I sat in the control room, surrounded by instruments that registered normal readings, while supernatural forces turned my workplace into a monument to maritime tragedy. The voices weren't trying to frighten me. They were trying to be remembered, to have their stories acknowledged by someone still breathing. That night, I understood my true role aboard the Northern Sentinel. I wasn't just a night shift worker monitoring equipment and maintaining safety protocols. I was a witness, a living record keeper for experiences that existed beyond official documentation. Every supernatural encounter, every unexplained phenomenon, every moment of supernatural contact became part of my responsibility to preserve and remember. The rules exist not to protect us from the supernatural, but to help us coexist with forces that have legitimate claims to these waters. The spirits aboard the Northern Sentinel aren't invaders, they're residents. We're the ones passing through their domain, and survival depends on showing proper respect for the presence. Following the rules doesn't eliminate the supernatural encounters. It simply ensures they remain encounters rather than confrontations. Break the rules. Ignore the protocols passed down through generations of night shift workers, and you risk becoming part of the ship's permanent crew, the kind that never goes ashore again. As I write this, preparing for another shift aboard the Northern Sentinel, I can hear her calling from the harbor. Her voice carries across the water, mechanical sounds mixed with something older and more elemental. She's waiting for me to return, to take my place in the control room and stand watch over secrets that daylight workers will never comprehend. The rules have become second nature now, as automatic as checking gauges or monitoring radar. But each night brings new experiences, new tests of the protocols that separate the living from the lost. And sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I wonder if following the rules is enough to ensure I'll still be among the living when my contract ends. Tomorrow, I'll find out again. By my 8th month aboard the Northern Sentinel, I thought I'd experienced everything the ship could throw at me. The whispers in the ventilation system had become familiar background noise. The 3-knot pattern no longer made me jump. I'd learned to navigate the corridors without looking at mirrors, and I could distinguish between normal ship sounds and something else entirely. I was wrong. The ship had been testing me, gauging my reactions, waiting to see if I'd earned the right to witness her deeper mysteries. What I encountered during a routine cargo run from Duluth to Buffalo changed my understanding of what lived aboard the Northern Sentinel, and what had been living there long before I ever set foot on her deck. It was mid-February, the worst possible time to be crossing Lake Superior. The Weather Service had issued gale warnings, but shipping schedules don't accommodate the convenience of storms. We were hauling 70,000 tons of iron or pellets through seas that rose and fell like breathing mountains, each wave tall enough to swallow a lighthouse. The encounter began during my 2 a.m. deck inspection. Company policy required hourly visual checks of the cargo hatches and deck equipment, even in brutal weather. Most night shift workers found excuses to skip the exterior inspections during storms, but I'd learned that deviation from routine invited worse problems than freezing rain and 40-knot winds. I was checking the tensioning cables on hatch cover 12 when I noticed the figure. At first, I thought it was a crew member who'd come topside for some reason, maybe investigating the same equipment concerns that had brought me out into the storm. The figure stood near the bow, silhouetted against the navigation lights, wearing what appeared to be standard cold weather gear. But something about his posture struck me as wrong. He stood too still, too straight, showing no reaction to the wind that was strong enough to knock a grown man off his feet. I called out, my voice barely audible over the storm. "Hey, you need to get below deck." The figure turned toward me, and I saw his face in the glow of the forward navigation lights. It was like looking at someone through deep water, features distorted and wavering, but recognizably human. He wore the expression of a man who'd seen something so terrible that his face had locked into permanent shock. Then he began walking toward me. Not walking, floating. His feet moved in the motions of walking, but they didn't quite touch the deck. He glided across the steel surface with mechanical precision, unaffected by the ship's rolling motion or the ice that made every step treacherous for the living. I backed toward the superstructure, my rational mind insisting this was some trick of the storm lighting, some combination of fatigue and harsh weather conditions creating an optical illusion. But my body knew better. Every instinct screamed at me to get inside, to put steel walls and locked doors between myself and whatever was approaching. The figure stopped about 10 feet away from me. Up close, I could see details that made my vision blur with disbelief. His clothing was vintage, the kind of work gear worn by freighter crews in the 1960s. Frost covered his hair and eyebrows, but it didn't melt despite the relatively warm February air. Most disturbing of all, his eyes held a quality of awareness that made it clear he was seeing me as clearly as I was seeing him. He opened his mouth and spoke, his voice cutting through the storm with unnatural clarity, the waters rising in the forward hold. Then he vanished. Not gradually. Instantly, like someone had switched off a television. One moment he stood before me, solid enough to cast shadows in the navigation lights. The next moment, I was alone on the deck with nothing but wind and waves for company. I ran back to the control room, my hands shaking as I activated the forward hull monitoring system. The gauges showed normal conditions. No water intrusion, no pressure variations, no indication of problems. But the encounter had felt too real to ignore, and the figure's words carried the weight of urgent warning. I suited up and descended into the forward cargo hold, something I'd never done during a night shift. The hold stretched enormous around me, filled with thousands of tons of iron or pellets that shifted and whispered with each wave. My flashlight beam seemed inadequate for the vast space, creating pools of light that only emphasized the surrounding darkness. That's when I found the water. It wasn't showing up on the monitoring systems because it wasn't coming through the hull. It was seeping up through the cargo itself, appearing from some source deep within the hold that shouldn't have existed. The water was ice cold and carried a smell that reminded me of algae and something else, something organic and long dead. I followed the water to its source and discovered a crack in the hold floor that hadn't been there during the previous shift. The crack was roughly 6 feet long and perhaps 3 inches wide, and from its depths came the sound of water moving far below the ship's normal waterline. More disturbing still, the sound carried voices, faint and distorted, but recognizably human. I reported the crack to the engineering department via radio, describing it as a potential structural issue that needed immediate attention. Within 20 minutes, 3-day shift engineers had joined me in the hold, armed with inspection equipment and repair materials. But they couldn't find the crack. We searched the entire forward hold, moving tons of cargo and examining every square inch of floor plating. The engineers found nothing. No crack, no water seepage, no structural irregularities. Their instruments showed perfect hull integrity. According to every scientific method at our disposal, the crack I'd observed didn't exist. Yet my boots were still wet from standing in water that had defied the laws of physics and maritime engineering. The second encounter occurred 3 weeks later during a midnight crossing of Lake Huron. We were running light. No cargo, just ballast water, heading to pick up a load of limestone from Rogers City. The empty cargo holds created different acoustics during light runs, amplifying sounds and creating echo effects that could be disorienting for new crew members. I was conducting routine engine room inspections when I heard the singing. It came from somewhere deep in the ship, below the engine room and beyond the ballast tanks. A woman's voice, clear and hauntingly beautiful, singing what sounded like a lullaby in a language I couldn't identify. The melody was hypnotic, weaving through the mechanical, sounds like smoke through a forest. Following the song violated every rule I'd learned about night shift survival, but something about the voice made resistance impossible. It called to me with the same irresistible pull that draws moths to flame, promising answers to questions I hadn't known I was asking. I descended deeper into the ship than I'd ever gone before, following maintenance ladders and service corridors that seemed to exist in a parallel version of the Northern Sentinel. The singing grew stronger as I went deeper, joined by other voices that harmonized in perfect, impossible unity. Eventually, I reached a section of the ship that shouldn't have existed. The corridor was older than the rest of the vessel, constructed from steel that showed decades more wear and corrosion. The air tasted of salt water and time, thick enough to make breathing difficult. At the end of the corridor, I found a door that wasn't marked on any ship's blueprint I'd ever seen. The singing came from behind this door, now so beautiful and compelling that tears ran down my face without my permission. I reached for the handle, knowing that opening this door would show me something that would change me forever. The door opened before I could touch it. Inside was a room filled with water, not flooded, but existing in a state where water and air occupied the same space without conflict. In this impossible room, I saw them, dozens of figures standing in perfect formation, their mouths open in eternal song. Men and women wearing the uniforms of Great Lakes crews from across the decades, their eyes closed in rapturous concentration as they performed their supernatural chorus. One of the figures, a woman wearing a 1940s-era life jacket, opened her eyes and looked directly at me. She smiled with genuine warmth and beckoned for me to join them. The invitation was more tempting than anything I had ever experienced. A promise of belonging, of purpose, of never being alone again in the vast darkness of the lakes. I stepped backward instead of forward, and the door slammed shut with enough force to shake the entire corridor. The singing stopped immediately, replaced by a silence so complete that my ears rang with its intensity. When I turned to retrace my path, I found myself standing in the normal engine room, surrounded by familiar machinery and proper lighting. My watch showed that 3 hours had passed, though my subjective experience had lasted perhaps 15 minutes. The duty log showed no record of my extended absence, and the ship's automated systems had continued their normal operations without any indication that I'd left my post. But my boots were wet again, and this time they smelled of lake water that had been still for decades. The encounters continued throughout the rest of the shipping season, each one more intense and more specific than the last. I learned to recognize the signs that preceded supernatural activity: a sudden drop in temperature, changes in air pressure that made my ears pop, and an electrical charge that made the hair on my arm stand up. Most importantly, I learned that the entities aboard the Northern Sentinel weren't random spirits or residual hauntings. They were actively trying to communicate, to share experiences and warnings that might be vital for the safety of living crew members. The figure on the deck had warned me about actual water intrusion, even though it manifested in ways that defied normal detection. The singing voices in the impossible room had offered me a choice: join them willingly or risk being claimed involuntarily. These weren't malevolent presences trying to harm the living. They were former crew members who remained bound to the ship, serving as eternal guardians for waters that had claimed too many lives. Their warnings and manifestations weren't designed to frighten. They were attempts to prevent more names from being added to the roster of the lost. But understanding their benevolent intentions didn't make the encounters less terrifying or their implications less disturbing. Each supernatural contact reminded me that the boundary between the living and the dead was much thinner aboard the Northern Sentinel than anywhere else I'd ever been. And each night, as I prepared for another shift, I wondered if the next encounter would be my last as a member of the living crew, or my first as something else entirely. The thing about working alone during the graveyard shift is that you become your own detective, coroner, and historian all rolled into one. When strange things happen and you're the only witness, you either dismiss them as hallucinations brought on by sleep deprivation and isolation, or you start documenting everything with the desperate precision of someone who knows the truth but can't prove it to anyone else. I chose documentation. My evidence collection began during my 10th month aboard the Northern Sentinel, triggered by an incident that left physical proof too compelling to ignore. We were hauling taconite pellets from 2 harbors to Cleveland when I discovered the photographs. They were tucked inside the duty log binder, stuffed between routine maintenance reports and weather observations. Polaroid photos, the kind that instant cameras produced before digital photography, made everything crisp and easily manipulated. The images were faded with age. Their colors shifted toward yellow and green, but what they showed was unmistakable. The first photo depicted the ship's forward deck during what appeared to be a storm. Waves crashed over the cargo hatches while a figure in rain gear worked to secure loose equipment. Nothing unusual about that, except the figure was translucent. You could see the cargo hatch covers through his body, and his feet cast no shadow on the wet steel deck. The second photo showed the engine room during what must have been a night shift inspection. In the background, barely visible among the machinery, stood three figures in work clothes. They appeared solid enough, but their clothing belonged to different eras. One wore the coveralls typical of 1960s maritime workers. Another was dressed in 1980s gear, and the third wore clothing that looked even older, possibly from the 1950s. The third photo was the most disturbing. It showed the crew mess hall, empty except for a single figure seated at one of the tables. The figure was clearly visible, wearing a modern uniform that I recognized as current company issue. But his face was missing, not obscured by shadows or photographic artifacts, but actually absent, as if someone had carefully erased his features while leaving the rest of his head intact. On the back of each photo, someone had written dates and times in careful handwriting. October 15th, 1994, 0347 hours. March 22nd, 1998, 0156 hours. September 8th, 2003, 0412 hours. All-night shift hours, all documented by someone who'd been in my position years before I ever set foot aboard the Northern Sentinel. I started carrying a digital camera during my shifts, determined to create my own record of the supernatural activity I witnessed. The results were frustrating and illuminating in equal measure. Normal photography seemed unable to capture the entities I encountered. They appeared clearly to my naked eye, but showed up as vague anomalies or atmospheric disturbances in digital images. Shadows where no objects existed to cast them, unexplained light sources, and areas of distortion that looked like heat mirages and sub-freezing temperatures. But occasionally, the camera captured something extraordinary. During a December crossing of Lake Superior, I photographed what appeared to be a massive shadow beneath the ship. The water was crystal clear, visibility extending down at least 30 feet, but my camera showed something enormous moving parallel to our course about 50 feet below the surface. The shadow was roughly the same size and shape as our vessel, as if another Northern Sentinel was traveling upside down beneath us through the dark water. When I checked the image against our navigation equipment, I discovered something that made my hands shake. The shadow ship was traveling in the opposite direction. We were heading southeast toward the Sioux Locks, but the underwater vessel was moving northwest, following the exact route of the Edmund Fitzgerald during her final voyage in November 1975. The discovery prompted me to research the maritime history of the Great Lakes more thoroughly than my initial training had required. What I learned connected the supernatural activity aboard the Northern Sentinel to a broader pattern of tragedy and mystery that stretches back over a century. The Great Lakes have claimed more than 6,000 ships since the mid-1800s, along with the lives of approximately 30,000 mariners. These aren't just statistics. They represent an enormous concentration of sudden, violent death in a relatively confined geographical area. The lakes preserve everything. The frigid water and lack of oxygen prevent normal decomposition, meaning that ships and bodies sink to the bottom and remain virtually unchanged for decades. But preservation isn't limited to physical remains. According to local folklore, the lakes themselves serve as repositories for psychic energy, storing the final moments of terror and desperation experienced by drowning sailors. This energy doesn't dissipate over time. It accumulates, creating areas where the boundary between the living world and whatever comes after becomes permeable. The Northern Sentinel appears to be particularly sensitive to this phenomenon because of her route and her history. She regularly passes over or near the final resting places of famous wrecks. The Edmund Fitzgerald, the Carl D. Bradley, the Daniel J. Morrell, and dozens of lesser-known vessels whose names live only in maritime records and the memories of the families they left behind. More disturbing still, I discovered that our ship had been present during several modern maritime disasters. She was part of the search effort when the Edmund Fitzgerald went down in 1975, one of the vessels that spent days looking for survivors who were never found. She assisted in the recovery operations after the Carl D. Bradley broke apart in 1958, pulling bodies from water so cold that they were perfectly preserved but completely lifeless. The Northern Sentinel wasn't just passing through haunted waters. She was an active participant in the creation of the very legends and tragedies that now manifested aboard her decks. This realization led me to examine the ship's crew records more carefully. I discovered a pattern that the maritime industry seemed determined to ignore. The Northern Sentinel had an unusually high turnover rate among night shift workers. Men would sign on for a season and quit after a few months, citing personal reasons or family obligations. Others simply disappeared from the crew roster without explanation, their employment records showing only that they'd failed to report for duty, without any follow-up investigation. A few had died under mysterious circumstances, heart attacks in healthy young men, accidents that occurred in areas of the ship where they had no business being. One man, according to a 1987 incident report, was found frozen to death in his locked cabin during a mild October night, his face displaying an expression of such terror that several crew members required psychological counseling after discovering his body. But the most compelling evidence came from an unexpected source: the ship's own instruments. Modern freighters carry sophisticated monitoring equipment that records everything from engine performance to hull stress. These systems create permanent logs that can be reviewed to diagnose mechanical problems or investigate incidents. What I discovered while reviewing these logs defied every principle of physics and engineering I'd ever learned. During supernatural encounters, the ship's instruments recorded anomalies that should have been impossible. Temperature sensors showed localized cold spots that dropped 40 degrees in seconds, then returned to normal without any identifiable cause. Pressure gauges detected sudden changes in atmospheric conditions that occurred only in specific areas of the vessel, creating microclimates that existed for minutes before vanishing completely. Most significantly, the ship's hull stress monitors recorded impacts during encounters with supernatural entities. When a translucent figure walked across the forward deck during that February storm, the instruments showed footsteps, actual pressure readings indicating something with considerable mass was moving across the steel surface. The readings were consistent with a person weighing approximately 180 pounds, despite the fact that the figure cast no shadow and left no physical traces. The electromagnetic anomalies were equally compelling. During periods of supernatural activity, the ship's compass readings became erratic, pointing toward magnetic north one moment and swinging wildly off course the next. Radio equipment picked up transmissions on frequencies that weren't assigned to any known stations, broadcasting voices, speaking in maritime terminology that hadn't been used since the 1940s. But the most disturbing instrumental evidence came from the ship's sonar system. During my encounter with the underwater shadow, the sonar painted a clear picture of something massive moving beneath us. The reading showed an object approximately 729 feet in length, exactly the size of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The object maintained a steady course and speed that matched our own movement, staying precisely 50 feet below our keel for over 2 hours before disappearing from the sonar screen as suddenly as it had appeared. I cross-referenced this data with historical records and discovered something that made my blood run cold. The Edmund Fitzgerald had been following the exact same route when she went down in 1975. And the timing of the sonar contact coincided almost precisely with the anniversary of her sinking. November 10th, 1975 versus November 12th of my encounter. Close enough to suggest that whatever I detected was operating on a schedule tied to historical tragedy rather than current navigation requirements. The local folklore surrounding the Great Lakes provided additional context for these instrumental readings. Native American legends speak of underwater spirits that guide the souls of drowning sailors to their final rest. French voyagers reported encounters with phantom vessels that appeared during storms, leading lost ships to safety or warning them away from dangerous waters. Even modern shipping companies, despite their corporate reluctance to acknowledge anything supernatural, maintain informal protocols for dealing with unusual sightings during night operations. The most comprehensive collection of Great Lakes supernatural lore I discovered came from an unexpected source: the shipping industry itself. Retired captains and engineers, men who'd spent decades navigating these waters, have been documenting strange encounters for generations. Their reports, shared quietly among maritime professionals, painted a picture of ongoing supernatural activity that extended far beyond the Northern Sentinel. Captain Elizabeth Hartley, who'd spent 37 years commanding Great Lakes vessels, shared her records with me during a chance encounter at the Sulaks. Her logbooks contained dozens of entries describing unexplained phenomena: ghost ships that appeared on radar but couldn't be reached by radio, mysterious fog banks that formed in clear weather and dissipated within minutes, and coordinated search and rescue operations that located survivors in areas that had already been thoroughly searched by multiple vessels. "The lakes remember everything," she told me as we watched the Northern Sentinel navigate through the lock system. "Every ship that's gone down, every life that's been lost, every moment of terror and desperation. It all stays here, preserved in the water like insects trapped in amber. Some vessels are more sensitive to it than others. And yours." She paused, studying the Northern Sentinel with experienced eyes. "Yours carries more history than most." Her observation prompted me to investigate the ship's construction history more thoroughly. I discovered that the Northern Sentinel had been built using steel salvage from decommissioned Great Lakes vessels, including plates recovered from ships that had been involved in fatal accidents. The practice was economically sensible. High-grade marine steel was expensive, and salvage material could be refurbished and reused if it met safety specifications. But what if the steel retained more than just structural integrity? What if the metal itself served as a conductor for the psychic energy that Captain Hartley claimed was preserved in the lakes? The possibility suggested that the Northern Sentinel wasn't just traveling through haunted waters. She was constructed from the very materials that had witnessed maritime tragedies firsthand. This theory gained credibility when I discovered the ship's acoustic properties. Certain areas of the vessel, particularly those constructed with salvaged steel, produced unusual sound effects during supernatural encounters. Voices seemed to emerge from the metal itself, as if the conversations and final words of long-dead sailors had been embedded in the atomic structure of the steel and were being played back under the right conditions. The evidence I collected, photographs, instrumental readings, historical records, and first-hand testimonies from veteran mariners, painted a compelling picture of supernatural activity that went far beyond individual hallucinations or sleep deprivation-induced paranoia. The phenomena I'd experienced aboard the Northern Sentinel were part of a larger pattern that had been documented by hundreds of maritime professionals over the course of decades. But documentation and understanding were two different things. Having evidence of supernatural activity didn't make the encounters less terrifying or provide any guarantee of safety during future shifts. If anything, the weight of evidence made the situation more ominous. I wasn't dealing with random, ghostly activity or isolated incidents. I was working aboard a vessel that served as a focal point for over a century of accumulated maritime tragedy. Every night, as I prepared for another shift, I reviewed my growing collection of evidence and wondered what new phenomena would add themselves to the record. The supernatural activity aboard the Northern Sentinel wasn't diminishing with documentation. It was intensifying, as if my attention and acknowledgement were somehow feeding the entities that inhabited the ship's steel bones. And sometimes, Late at night, when the ship's instruments recorded anomalies that defied explanation, and my camera captured shadows that shouldn't exist, I wondered if I was still documenting the supernatural activity or if I'd become part of it myself. Another entry in a logbook that stretched back through decades of night shift workers who'd witnessed things that living men weren't meant to see. The line between observer and participant was becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish, and I suspected that crossing it completely was only a matter of time. After 14 months aboard the Northern Sentinel, I began to question not just what I was experiencing, but who I was becoming. The supernatural encounters had evolved from isolated incidents to nightly occurrences. The entities aboard the ship no longer seemed like intruders or anomalies. They felt like colleagues, fellow workers maintaining their eternal shifts alongside my temporary employment. This realization should have terrified me. Instead, it brought a sense of belonging that was more disturbing than any ghostly manifestation I'd witnessed. The psychological toll of working in constant proximity to supernatural activity is something no employee handbook addresses. Sleep becomes elusive when your dreams are populated by the faces of long-dead sailors. Appetite disappears when the ship's galley echoes with conversations in languages you don't recognize, spoken by voices that shouldn't exist. Social relationships deteriorate when you can't explain why you prefer the company of phantoms to living crew members who seem increasingly foreign and difficult to relate to. But the most insidious change was how normal the abnormal had become. The three-knot pattern that once sent adrenaline surging through my veins now served as a comforting reminder that I wasn't truly alone during the long, dark hours. The translucent figures I encountered during deck inspections had become familiar presences whose appearances I anticipated and welcomed. The singing voices from the impossible room below had evolved into a nightly lullaby that helped ease the transition from one shift to another. I was adapting to life aboard a haunted ship, and the adaptation was changing me in ways that extended far beyond mere professional experience. The breaking point came during what I now think of as the final voyage, though it wasn't actually my last time aboard the Northern Sentinel. It occurred during a late-season run from Duluth to Buffalo, carrying the year's final load of iron, or before winter ice closed the shipping lanes. The weather was brutal even by Great Lakes standards, with sustained winds over 50 knots in waves that regularly broke over the ship's superstructure. We should have waited for the storm to pass, but shipping companies don't like to leave profitable cargo sitting in dock while paying crew salaries. The decision to sail was made by executives who'd never experienced Lake Superior in November, men who understood profit margins better than they understood the murderous capabilities of inland seas during winter storms. 3 hours out of Duluth, we received a distress call from another freighter, the Great Plains, reporting engine failure and loss of steering control about 12 miles south of our position. The Coast Guard requested that we divert to assist, despite the deteriorating conditions that made rescue operations extremely hazardous. Captain Morrison agreed to the diversion, but the stress showed in his face as he calculated wind speeds, wave heights, and the time remaining before the storm reached its full intensity. "We'll give it our best shot," he announced over the ship's communication system. "But if conditions get any worse, we'll have to let the Coast Guard handle it." As we changed course toward the distressed vessel, something extraordinary happened aboard the Northern Sentinel. The supernatural activity, which normally remained subtle and isolated, became coordinated and purposeful. Every entity that had ever manifested during my shifts appeared simultaneously, creating a gathering that transformed the ship into something beyond haunted. It became a vessel literally crewed by the dead. The translucent figure from a forward deck took his position at the bow, serving as an additional lookout scanning for the disabled ship. The 3 figures from the engine room appeared at their posts, monitoring equipment with spectral hands that somehow interacted with physical controls. The singing voices from the impossible room began a new song, not the haunting lullaby I had grown accustomed to, but something that sounded like a working song, the kind sailors once sang to coordinate heavy labor. Most remarkably, they seemed to be helping. The ship's navigation systems, which had been struggling with the massive waves and fierce winds, suddenly began functioning with preternatural precision. Our radar painted a clearer picture of the surrounding area than should have been possible in such conditions. The engines maintained steady power despite the strain of fighting through mountainous seas. Even the hull stress readings, which should have been fluctuating wildly as we rode the storm swells, showed stable patterns that suggested something was helping to distribute the physical forces more evenly across the ship's structure. We found the Great Plains dead in the water, her crew of 23 men preparing to abandon ship as their vessel took on water faster than her palms could handle. The rescue operation should have been impossible in those conditions. Waves were running 25 to 30 feet, with winds that made maintaining position alongside another vessel nearly suicidal. But the Northern Sentinel handled like she was being piloted by someone with decades more experience than Captain Morrison possessed. We maneuvered alongside the disabled freighter with supernatural precision, maintaining perfect position despite conditions that should have made close-quarters navigation impossible. The rescue took 4 hours. For hours of fighting mountainous waves and screaming winds while transferring 23 men from a sinking ship to our deck. During the entire operation, I was aware of additional crew members working alongside our living personnel. Translucent figures passing lines, securing equipment, and coordinating activities with the kind of seamless efficiency that comes only from years of working together. The dead were helping us save the living. When the last man was safely aboard the Northern Sentinel, and we'd pulled clear of the sinking Great Plains, Captain Morrison found me in the control room. His face showed the exhaustion and stress of commanding a rescue operation in impossible conditions, but his eyes held something else, a recognition that we'd experienced something beyond normal seamanship. "You saw them too," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." He nodded slowly, staring out at the storm-tossed lake where the Great Plains was disappearing beneath the waves. My grandfather sailed these lakes for 40 years. He always said the dead never really leave the water. They just change shifts. Tonight, I think I understand what he meant. The supernatural crew remained visible throughout the rest of the voyage, working their eternal shifts alongside the living crew members who'd grown accustomed to their presence over the years. I realized that what I'd interpreted as a haunting was actually something far more complex, a collaboration between the living and the dead that had been ongoing for decades. The entities aboard the Northern Sentinel weren't trapped spirits or malevolent presences. They were former crew members who'd chosen to remain aboard the ship, continuing their service in death as they had in life. They maintained their watches, operated their equipment, and protected their vessel from the supernatural dangers that prowled the Great Lakes during the dark hours between midnight and dawn. But their service came with a price, and I was beginning to understand what that price entailed. Over the following weeks, I noticed changes in my physical appearance that went beyond the normal effects of shift work and lake weather. My reflection in mirrors showed a man who was aging faster than the calendar suggested, developing the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades at sea rather than just over a year. My eyes had taken on the same distant quality I'd observed in veteran mariners, the look of someone who'd seen things that left permanent marks on the soul. More disturbing still, I was beginning to see the living crew members as temporary, transient presences aboard a ship that belonged primarily to the dead. The supernatural entities felt more real, more permanent, more essential to the vessel's operation than the men who drew paychecks and went home to families on shore. I was becoming one of them. The realization should have prompted me to quit immediately, to walk away from the Northern Sentinel and find work that didn't require daily interaction with the supernatural. But leaving felt like abandoning my post. deserting colleagues who depended on me to maintain the delicate balance between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Besides, where else could I find work that mattered as much as what I was doing aboard the Northern Sentinel? The shipping company paid me to monitor instruments and maintain equipment, but my real job was serving as a bridge between two crews, one that appeared on official personnel records, and another that existed in the ship's steel memory of everyone who'd ever served aboard Great Lakes vessels. As I write this, preparing for what may be my final season aboard the Northern Sentinel, I'm no longer certain whether the supernatural activity I've documented is real in any objective sense. The evidence exists: photographs, instrument readings, witness testimonies, historical records. But evidence can be interpreted in multiple ways, depending on the observer's willingness to accept possibilities that exist outside conventional understanding. What I know with absolute certainty is that working aboard the Northern Sentinel has changed me in fundamental ways that extend far beyond professional experience. I've learned to navigate not just the physical geography of the Great Lakes, but the supernatural landscape that exists parallel to the shipping channels and navigation routes that appear on official charts. I've gained colleagues whose dedication to their work transcends the boundary between life and death, whose knowledge of these waters encompasses decades of experience that no living mariner could match. I've participated in rescue operations that succeeded only because the dead chose to help the living, and I've witnessed acts of supernatural courage that put human bravery to shame. But most importantly, I've learned that some questions don't have answers that satisfy our need for certainty and closure. The reality of what occurs aboard the Northern Sentinel during the long, dark hours of the night shift exists independently of my ability to prove or explain it. The supernatural activity continues whether I document it or ignore it, whether I believe in it or dismiss it as hallucination. The ship sails on, crewed by both the living and the dead, carrying cargo across waters that remember every tragedy and preserve every lost soul in their icy depths. The night shift continues, maintained by men whose employment contracts extend far beyond their biological lifespans, whose dedication to their duties transcends the normal boundaries of human service. And somewhere in the darkness between midnight and dawn, in the space where the mechanical sounds of a working freighter blend with the whispers of drowned sailors, the truth waits for the next night shift worker brave enough or foolish enough to seek it out. The question isn't whether the supernatural activity aboard the Northern Sentinel is real. The question is whether you're prepared to discover what reality actually encompasses when experienced from the deck of a ship that serves as a monument to everyone who's ever been claimed by the Great Lakes. If you think you are, there's always another shipping season starting, and the Northern Sentinel is always looking for someone willing to work the night shift. Just remember, some jobs follow you home. Others become home, and once you've learned to hear the darkness whisper your name, you'll never be satisfied with the sound of silence again.